Yes. OH. There we go. Fantastic. Well, I guess this means it's a friendly audience, I suppose. I think we're probably going to spend the first few minutes making certain that the microphone doesn't blare out on us. So I chose a provocative title, but it's not my provocative title. This is from Nick Carr, who will approach in just a moment. But he very famously asked in an Atlantic article about 5 years ago, and then he later wrote a book about it. He essentially asked this question: is Google making us stupid? And that's the theme I wanted to explore here, largely looking ahead, looking at the future of the brain-internet interface, but also starting off by looking at where we've been and what that might be able to tell us about what that interface is going to look like. But I'd like to start with a level-setting cartoon, and whatever else you might think of Gary Trudeau's politics, Doonesbury is particularly good, I think, at capturing or understanding broad social trends, in particular tech trends and trends in education. So I actually wanted to start with a Doonesbury cartoon. And I'll read this because it's probably going to be difficult for those of you in the back to see it. But it takes place in a lecture hall at some sort of unnamed, or actually I guess this is Walden University, which is the school there in Doonesbury. So that's Zipper Harris, the ne'er-do-well college student, typing away. And his device pings him, and it says, "Heads up, dude, Professor Askins just asked you a question." And he writes back, "About what?" "No clue, I just heard your name." "Maybe if I ignore her, she'll think I'm taking notes." Click, 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 click. "She just asked you again, man, 4 major greenhouse gases." And he writes back, "Stall her while I Google it." From the back of the auditorium, we hear, "Professor, we couldn't hear the question back here. Could you repeat it?" I asked Zipper to name 4 major greenhouse gases, to which he immediately says, water vapor, CO2, ozone, and methane. And the teacher says, right. "You owe me, dude. If this keeps up, I'll never get through my email." Click, 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 click. So I've shown this cartoon, so I do a lot of engagements with teachers in particular, and I show this cartoon to teachers, and initially they're scandalized by this, right? And they're saying, "This is why we shouldn't have electronic devices in our classrooms. This is the reason why." And you press them further, and you press them further, and they ultimately say, "This is cheating." First of all, it's cheating, right? I asked him a question, and he had to Google the answer. That's the problem, right? And then they also talk about the fact that it's a disruption. They're not paying, they're not paying attention to me. Students aren't paying attention to me. Plus, not only are they distracted, but this is like an organized distraction, right? Because they're carrying out this conversation that's outside the boundaries of the class. And then, as you press teachers a little further, they start to see some of the folly that this represents. If our schooling, and this is the way schooling is based today, if our schooling is about providing answers, and that's really what schooling is about, the K through 12 level. It's about providing answers. And if that's what schooling is going to be about, well, then Google and the internet and other sorts of technologies like that are going to make that kind of schooling irrelevant pretty quickly. It already is, I think, in some ways. As long as we assume that schooling and education is about providing answers, students can very easily, even very poor students, as he is, can nevertheless provide answers pretty readily, pretty easily. This is one of the themes I want to wrestle with in my time with you here this evening, this question of what's Google doing to our brains? At a minimum, there are those that are arguing that it's doing our thinking for us, right? He doesn't know the answers. He doesn't have those embossed on his brain. He has to use the crutch of the internet or Google to be able to come up with that answer. I think this is actually probably more this sort of view. In fact, I think it's already sort of happening today, but this is, I think, where our future is going. And in fact, it's a future that looks an awful lot like our past, I think. Vince didn't say, I hold an appointment in the Department of History. So as an historian, I have to think historically about these sorts of issues. Here's the Atlantic article, "Is Google Making Us Stupid?" And it's the subtitle that I find particularly interesting as well. what the internet is doing to our brains. And Carr spends an awful lot of time talking about that, what it's doing to our brains. Not just simply doing our thinking for us, but it's actually affecting physical changes to our brains. There are studies out now that suggest that increased internet using is actually rewiring our brains. And that is quite unsettling to a lot of people, especially to someone like Nick Carr. Someone who, a group of thinkers, John Brockman in this case, if you read The Edge, or Edge, it's sort of I don't know, a current events magazine written by scientists. And they debate sort of topics like this, and there's usually a big question every year. And this one was, is the internet changing the way you think, the net's impact on our minds and future? And these are leading scientists and technologists that are thinking through the implications of our increased use of the internet. What are the implications of the increased use of the internet on our brains? As I said, Carr was particularly interested, or particularly concerned, rather, about the way in which using the internet, using electronic communications is rewiring the very structure of our brains. There are people who are concerned that it's changing the way we think. There are others that are concerned that the internet is doing our thinking for us. This is very problematic, obviously. I would like to argue that this isn't as problematic as Carr and others have made it out to be. About 15 years ago, two philosophers in cognitive science, this is really something that comes from the discipline of cognitive science. Andy Clark and David Chalmers were the philosophers in question. They posited what's been called the extended mind hypothesis. And it's become, I mean, it's still sort of, I think, debated pretty vigorously. But as you'll see in my presentation here, I'm sort of a big fan or big believer in the extended mind hypothesis. And what that basically says is long before the internet, and as you'll see here, I'm going to push this back about 40,000 years. Human beings have been engaged in thinking and cognition with tools for a very, very long time. And in fact, what the extended mind hypothesis says is that thinking, what we call thinking, is by definition something that occurs not just simply inside the skull, not just simply the wetware of the brain, but in concert with external devices, external tools. That is all thinking. It's not thinking with the assistance of. The brain plus devices engages in cognition, in thinking. That's what this sort of crudely structured equation is about, that the brain plus cognitive technologies equals mind, or cognition, or thinking, however you want to sort of describe that. But that is sort of the essence of the extended mind hypothesis. It has been, if you study sort of Western history, Western meaning the Western civilization, Western history, since the time of Descartes, it has been a conceit of Western philosophy that thinking only goes inside the brain, only inside the skull. It's just this object here that engages in thinking. And the extended mind hypothesis has really challenged it. I think challenged it fairly successfully. I said we were going to go back 40,000 or so years. And I'm going to start with cave paintings. Don't worry, we're going to get to the future soon enough. We're going to get to brain-internet interfaces. But I want to suggest that this idea of extended mind or extended cognition or letting our objects do our thinking for us is something that is very long-lasting and, in fact, has been a key definition, I think, of what it means to be Homo sapiens. Cave paintings, again, we find them all throughout the old world. They date variously to about from 40,000 to about 25,000 years ago. I would argue that cave paintings were our first example of information. If we define information as the physical storage of thought and symbols outside our bodies, then cave paintings were our first instances of this. We're not exactly certain what early humans were doing when they were painting these. My best guess is that they were probably remembering a hunt. Remember that great big bison we all found? Wasn't that awesome? And so you draw a picture of it, tell stories around it. But the idea is that doesn't stay here, or isn't just simply communicated through words. Now we can sort of permanently remember it, or as long as the pigment will stay on the wall. We can remember that hunt. After I'm gone, we can remember that hunt because we've stored it this way. That is the very definition of information. Symbols that we store outside of our bodies so that we can retrieve them later and we can analyze them or pass them off to someone else. By definition, that's what we call culture. And as I said, this extends all the way back to this very early example of prehistory. Writing is probably the key example of what I'm talking about. Even, I'm one who wants to push this idea back even further. A lot of people point to writing as a perfect example, as the perfect case of what we mean by extended mind, of coupled cognition. So the first writing systems were developed essentially to be accounting systems. If you read very early written systems, they're actually quite boring. There's no literature or anything like that. It's essentially grocery lists is what it amounts to, right? So 4 oxen, 7 jars of wine, 15 bushels of wheat. They're really very boring like that. But the reason that human beings developed writing, and you remember this from your Western civilization, from your history courses that you all took, right? Says an historian. But the reason we developed writing is that we couldn't keep all that information in our heads. As long as what we were remembering was quite small, 1 or 2 oxen, a few people in our village, we don't need an external system of storage. That's not really necessary. But as societies grow larger and larger and larger and more complex, one person or even a group of people can't keep all that information stored here. We developed writing to help us remember, to make sense of that information, to store it, to save it for a certain period of time. We ultimately learn to think with writing. We learn to think with our written tools. Writing systems, cave paintings, are all examples of what I would call an information cloud. We talk about cloud computing today, and we all know that that has a certain kind of technical definition to it, but think about what cloud computing is. Take information and store it someplace else, right? We call it the cloud. We all know what it means, right? It's on servers, wherever those servers might be, wherever the server farm might be. The idea is that I don't carry that information with me on this device. That information is pushed somewhere else. And in essence, I would argue we've had a cloud for tens of thousands of years. We push information someplace else, onto someplace else, right? Either on cave walls or on tablets like this. But information gets pushed somewhere outside of our bodies, somewhere outside of our brains. Writing, of course, is one of these great triumphs of human history. And the idea that human beings developed writing to solve these certain problems, well, this seems sort of unproblematic. It's different from the internet, right? We know the internet is doing our thinking for us and is having all kinds of effects on our brains, and that's really problematic because that's never happened before. We've never developed a tool that's going to physically alter our brains. Well, it turns out that's not true either. And in fact, when you study writing, scholars and others who are studying writing, the effects of writing on the brain, are discovering some really interesting sorts of properties. Writing was something we had to invent. We were human beings long before we developed the ability to read and write. And in fact, what had to happen is that the brain had to be altered in order to be able to read and to write. One of these cognitive scientists is Stanislaw Duhaney. This is a terrific, albeit dense book called Reading in the Brain, The New Science of How We Read. And what he argues, in essence, is that before we could have writing, before we had the ability to read, we had to repurpose our brains. Our brains were not designed to read and write. They had to be altered to be able to read and write. He writes, if books and libraries have played a predominant role in the cultural evolution of our species, and I think we all agree that they have, it's because brain plasticity allowed us to recycle our primitive visual system into a language instrument. The invention of reading led to, his word, the mutation of our cerebral circuits into a reading device. He studies children learning how to read and write. He studies them and he puts them in fMRI machines, right? Functional MRI machines allows you to see what's going on in the brain sort of in real time. And you put people in through certain tasks and you watch how the brain lights up. We put children in these sorts of situations. As they're learning to read, he is watching, he is observing, he is documenting the way in which our brains are altered as we learn to read and write. So when people like Nick Carr say that the internet is bad because it's changing our brains physically, well then what? Do we conclude that reading and writing are bad because they alter our brains as well? We didn't have fMRI machines back when the first writing systems were developed, but I suspect that something very similar was happening. As writing became more widespread, I think the brains were being physically altered. That's not to say there haven't been critics of reading and writing. There most certainly were. That is Socrates, a name that I'm certain you know from your school days. Of course, he himself wrote nothing. We have nothing that Socrates wrote. He wrote nothing. It was others who sort of wrote down what he had to say. Plato wrote down what Socrates said. He was talking about writing and how much he disliked writing. For this discovery of yours will create forgetfulness in the learner's soul, because they will not use their memories. They will trust to the external written characters and not remember of themselves. In other words, they won't use their brains. They're going to come to rely on these written symbols to do their thinking for them. The specific which you have discovered is not an aid to memory, but to reminiscence, and you give your disciples not truth, but only the semblance of truth. They will be hearers of many things and will have learned nothing. They will appear to be omniscient and will generally know nothing. They will be tiresome company, having the show of wisdom without the reality. And I read a quote like that and I ask myself, was Socrates essentially saying writing will make us stupid? Yeah. And we say the same things about the internet. And we think that we live in extraordinary times. And we do. We live in extraordinary times. But as, again, an historian, one of the luxuries or one of the great things about being an historian is that it gives you a kind of perspective on things. And so when I read Nick Carr's book, I thought, you know what? I think he might be exaggerating a little. That's not to say that we don't have, that there aren't sort of larger issues around this brain-mind interface. I wanted to share this example with you. That's Richard Feynman, the great physicist. And there's this terrific story that's attributed about him. He was being interviewed by his historian, his biographer. His name was Charles Wiener was the guy's name. And as a typical historian, Wiener was thrilled to come across a series of documents from Feynman. This is what historians dream for, like these documents, right? Original notes, original sketches from the great physicist. And the historian remarked, and this is a quote, that the materials represented a record of Feynman's day-to-day work. But instead of simply sort of accepting that, Feynman was actually a little ticked off at what Wiener was saying about this. He says, I actually did the work on the paper. I actually did the work on the paper, he said. Well, the work was done in your head, but the record of it is still here. No, it's not a record. Not really. It's working. You have to work on paper, and this is the paper. Get it? He never did. He never got it. What Feynman is saying is that the thinking is not just simply going on in his brain. The thinking is going on in his brain with the help of the pencil and the paper. The two of them together produces his work. The idea here is that if we didn't have pencil and paper, if we didn't have writing, if we didn't have cave paintings, we would think differently. We would engage in a different level of cognition. These tools allow us to think differently. And that's the attitude we have to have, I think, when we look at the internet, when we look at the brain-internet interface, and where our future seems to be heading with that connection. Sergey Brin, of course, knows exactly where we're headed with this connection, right? If you had all the world's, certainly, if you had all the world's information directly attached to your brain, or an artificial brain that was smarter than your brain, you'd be better off. It's fairly obvious, isn't it, don't you think? Well, of course, Brin worries a lot of people, and with statements like this. Carr quotes this in particular, is really sort of worried about this. The internet, the arrival of the internet, the expansion of the internet over the last 20 or so years has expanded that system of external symbolic storage, that system we've developed, that cultural system. It's expanded it, but it's also made it easier for us to interact with it. If I wanted to read books, I have to go to a library, for instance. If I want to see cave paintings, I have to go to a site. The internet has made it easier for us very easy for us to tap in to that external system, pretty simply. But there are two unsettling ideas here, obviously. Two unsettling ideas. That external system is not just simply a great library, a great archive, but now is somehow intelligent. That's what Brin is sort of talking about here in a way. And so that's troubling. That's problematic for some. And then the second part, directly attached to your brain. That obviously worries a lot of people as well, right? What are we doing there with that kind of weird kind of intimacy with technology, right? That's very troubling as well. let's talk about sort of those in turn. I don't know if you know Ray Kurzweil and the whole notion of the singularity. Is this a term you know, or you understand what the singularity is? So the singularity is... Someone said it. Sorry? Silicon-carbon fusion. So intelligent machines and intelligent brains fuse together, ultimately at some point. The singularity, he would say it's in 2045. So we got 30 years, okay? And he bases this on essentially extending Moore's law onward and upward, right? And in fact, anybody who sort of sees that kind of symbiosis, that our machines are going to become as smart, if not smarter than we are, and we're going to be linked together in some fashion, holy or unholy, who knows. But it's all based on Moore's law, or at least on the idea that computational, I mean, you know Moore's law, obviously, that sort of expansion, that exponential expansion of computing power is going to continue on indefinitely. That's how you get to 2045, for instance. I'm a little skeptical, That's one view of the future. I think that's a possibility. But again, all of this is based on the assumption that Moore's law is going to continue to hold. And there's some very interesting, very thoughtful thinkers who are saying, you know, you actually can't expand computing power. You can't get smaller and smaller and smaller because eventually quantum mechanics starts to kick in. You're actually going to have devices where the electrons are going to start leaking out. In other words, there are limits to Moore's law. There are limits, and we're eventually going to run into them. Now, about 2 weeks ago, I read an article that suggested maybe we're going to stop using silicon and we'll start using germanium. And that might extend Moore's law a little further, but I'm still somewhat skeptical that we're going to continue on this kind of trajectory. And therefore, the singularity idea has all kinds of problems, I think, attached to it. And again, the sorts of things we're talking about, here is 2045. We're still talking about computation that's on the level of a human brain. He would ultimately like us to see all human brains. Again, I have a certain amount of skepticism about this. People point to Watson. Uh-oh, here's the problem, okay? Here the computers now are going to defeat human beings, right? Ken Jennings, the smug Ken Jennings is even beaten by Watson. And I'm sure everybody in this room has actually seen, well, this is what Watson was. Watson is now in a slightly different form, but Watson was essentially lots and lots of parallel processing computers, I think probably about the width of this room here, width of this space. And as actually, after Watson, after the Jeopardy championship, I was actually on record as saying I wasn't that impressed by it. At the end of the day, Watson is still a very, very, very good search engine. And Watson, in a sense, doesn't really sort of think on its own. It responds to our queries, or actually questions or answers from Alex Trebek. That's the only way it sort of logs on. It has to respond to one of our queries. And at the end of the day, all Watson is doing, in a very impressive fashion, but all Watson is doing is searching an enormous database and putting things together. And in fact, wasn't as, well, yes, he sort of ran away and he got, his $1 million and all this. But remember, this was on 2 nights, Final Jeopardy, or there was 2 nights of Jeopardy. On the first night, he missed the Final Jeopardy. I don't know why he's a he. It missed the Final Jeopardy question because it was ambiguously stated. The question was, there's a city that has 2 airports, both of which are named for events during the Second World War. And of course, that's in fact not exactly true. But the 2 human competitors figured out exactly. The answer is Chicago. So O'Hare, who was a fighter pilot, I guess, and Midway. But Midway's not named for the Battle of Midway. It's named because it's midway between sort of whatever points. Doesn't matter, the humans got it. Watson said Toronto. It was just completely wrong. And in fact, when Watson did that, you heard the engineers. There was a gasp, literally an audible gasp. He's wrong. It's not that smart at the end of the day. He's really quick. It's really quick. At the end of the day, as I said, this doesn't worry me in the way that someone like Kurzweil would say. We're heading ultimately toward computers or the internet or a collection of computers being smarter than we are. There are those, of course, who worry about what happens when the internet starts reacting and providing us results even before we query it. And so people that are talking about big data sort of spinning off on its own are already starting to talk in these terms. such as when Amazon says to you, if you ordered this, you might like this. And we're starting to see this more and more. Amazon, I don't know if you, so Amazon have just got a patent for, and I'm going to forget the name, the official name they have for it, but essentially by using big data algorithms, they'll be able to anticipate what consumers want to buy, and therefore will ship those products to consignment centers so that they can be ready to go on next day shipping or same day shipping once people actually order them. But they'll anticipatory, something like that. They will anticipate what you're going to buy before you even realize, you know what, I could use a new computer or whatever. And this is an example people are giving how the internet, how these connections of tools are already developing into a kind of intelligence that's separate, distinct, better than us? I don't know. I don't know the answer to this. There are others that suggest that this is really little more than a kind of a thermostat. And the thermostat, for instance, is regulating the temperature in this room, so we don't have to think about it. But none of us are sort of gasping, oh my goodness, the thermostat is thinking for us. Okay, this is the old cybernetics sort of question. Or traffic lights. We allow traffic lights to do our thinking for us, right? Telling us when to move. I actually think traffic lights are pretty stupid, especially as I'm sitting there at long lights. I think, by the way, ultimately with self-driving cars, we're going to eliminate the need for traffic lights, because that'll all be determined by algorithms, right? So if there's no traffic coming, my car will move out. That would be a real intelligence. Where we are right now, I think the internet is a brain. I think the internet today is a brain. It's just not a human brain. There are actually lots of brains on the planet, right? Dogs have brains, cats have brains. The internet, I think, you can make a very clear, compelling case, is a brain. It's just not a human brain. And I think our comparisons are always toward that sort of connection. I don't think that's the case. I think it's intelligent, it's even autonomous, but it's not a human brain. This is just a couple of images that point to the Internet of Things scenario, and I'm sure this is something that you're all familiar with, the idea of devices being able to communicate with each other such that if I buy a pint of Haagen-Dazs and go to put it in my refrigerator, it's going to ping my medicine cabinet, or at least my pill bottle, to know that I take a statin, and then it's probably going to tell me something like, Dave, do you really need that Haagen-Dazs with your cholesterol levels? To which I say, the hell with it, and I'll go ahead and eat my Haagen-Dazs anyway. But that my devices will be a sort of electronic Jiminy Cricket, right? That'll be speaking to me somehow to say, do you really need to do that? Right? Like nagging you, electronic nagging. Now, how it's going to nag us, I think, is particularly interesting. Narrative science is something that has been of concern, at least to writers. Narrative science is an algorithm, or it's a service that has an algorithm, that essentially takes spreadsheets of data and turns them into narrative prose. So if you have, for instance, and the example that's usually given are like baseball stats, they will turn those baseball stats into sort of a report of the ball game. And it's being sold to little leagues and these sorts of things. But journalists are actually quite worried about narrative science, putting them out of a job. And this is the direction we seem to be heading, right? Machines have always displaced human labor, but as long as that was labor, physical labor, well, we're okay with that, because all of us in this room, right, we think for a living. We don't have to worry about that. People that do physical labor, that's fine. But what happens when the machines, when these connections between computers starts to engage in thinking that looks an awful like what we do? Now we start getting threatened. Lawyers have long been threatened already by LegalZoom. TurboTax has made accountants really sort of worried about these sorts of things. Two recent books are essentially talking about these sorts of issues. Bryfogelson and McAfee, and of course Tyler Cowen's book, suggesting that, yeah, something really big is coming. The same way the Industrial Revolution eliminated lots of physical labor jobs, computers and the rise of the internet is going to eliminate a lot of the jobs that we've assumed to be sort of creative and only done by human beings. I'm a little skeptical. I think there's another sort of scenario that's going to play out here. I think there's another scenario, in fact, that's already playing out that we need to think about. But again, all of this is based on the assumption that the internet will become super intelligent, and not just simply intelligent, not just simply another kind of brain. I wanted to get back to this question, this scenario I had about the about the ice cream and the Haagen-Dazs. I'm interested in particular ways in which algorithms, the internet, the global brain, whatever you want to call it, how it's going to convey information to us, how it's going to say to me, don't eat that ice cream, or maybe you should make another choice, or something like that. Is there a future here? That's simply a question about Google Glass. So there is no more Google Glass, right? Pulled off the shelf, right? Throw those away. And some sort of interface like that, I think, if it's not Google Glass, it's going to be some sort of interface. And the reasons why they pulled Google Glass doesn't have necessarily to do with technical reasons, right? But that sort of interface worried some people, I think. They thought it was creepy in some ways. I'm not going to say the name. I can say the name, right, of what they call people who wear Google Glass. You've heard this term? Okay, glass holes. Yes, they're glass holes, right? They're saying, right. But I think this sort of interface it will become, let's look out 20 years, something like this. And it may not be Google Glass, but it'll be something. But some sort of device that's going to work directly on our eyes. Maybe it'll be some sort of contact lens or something like that, where we will be able to superimpose information onto an environment. So that when I go to my refrigerator, what pops up in front of my eyes is, do you really need to do that? Or danger, danger. Or what about your cholesterol level? That certainly could happen. For those who are creeped out by the idea of implants, one of the things I point to is that there are already people today who are directly connected to computers. If you know anybody who has a cochlear implant, we're already talking about the silicon-carbon interface. It's already here. It's here today. Now, of course, someone who is profoundly deaf, of course, it makes sense for them to have something like a cochlear implant. Will people in the future sort of voluntarily have such implants so they could better interface with information? That remains a question. Would people voluntarily say, not just simply buying Google Glass, but actually physically altering their bodies in order to have that sort of connection, that kind of intimacy with the internet? That remains a really big question, I think. This is just examples of how this interface is already working today outside of cochlear implants. And quadriplegics and paraplegics, of course, are using simply the power of their thoughts now to move cursors. These are things that are already sort of happening. The idea is that one day we'll be able to do that to manipulate information or to otherwise connect to the global brain that is represented by the internet. If you ever have a chance to see the movie Sight, it's about an 8-minute short film. I would urge you to see the film Sight for another vision, for this future. People with implants in their eyes, or we're not quite certain what it is. It's either contacts or actually some sort of implants in their eyes, but superimposing information on their environments. All of this, I think, all of these are very plausible scenarios about how we will interface, physically interface with the internet. This is Robert Sapolsky, the cognitive scientist. And I'm not going to read all of this, but he makes the observation, he makes the point that we developed tools such as data visualization as a way to deal with the increasing amounts of information that we deal with every single day. Data visualization, which is something we all understand, data visualization as an idea, as a concept, really didn't exist until about the 1980s. The idea that you could turn information into pictures sounded like dumbing down to a lot of people. Now we just take it as a matter of course. The way that you make sense of lots and lots of data, one way to make sense of lots and lots of data is to visualize it in various ways. And he talks about, we create three-dimensional scatter plots and rotate them and these sorts of things. But he says ultimately to cope with the amounts of information that we're going to contend with over the next few decades, it'll come from our grandkids, he says, who are growing up with, sort of who knows the sorts of things that they're going to encounter, that we're going to be like troglodytes of that stuff. But he says, we're not going to get much out of these vast data sets until we have people who can intuit in 6 dimensions. And then, watch out, he says. He doesn't actually explain what he means by intuit in 6 dimensions. But I'd like to play a little bit with what he's saying here and argue that more and more of our information, I think, if we're going to make sense of it, if we're going to interact with it, is going to come through all of our senses. All of our senses, not just simply sight, not just simply visualization. We will interact with the internet through sound, for instance. And I don't mean music, but I mean turning information into sound, patterns in which will be meaningful to us. I don't know if you've listened to Wikipedia. We tested this before. There it is. So every time there's an edit, there's that chime sound. And then every new person who registers on Wikipedia, it hasn't happened yet. This is happening in real time, so I'm not orchestrating this. But there'll be a long, there it is. That's someone who's just registered on Wikipedia. And so some of this is visual, obviously, but there's this oral component to it as well. And again, I mean, yes, it's a kind of music, sort of like Brian Eno. The idea is that the audio patterns are a kind of information. We will absorb information through sound, not just simply through visuals, through visualization. I sometimes play that. I confess, I sometimes play that in the background when I'm working. Burnishing my geek credentials here for everyone. So vision, sound, smell. I think we'll turn information from the internet into smells. And some of this is already starting to happen, mostly in the kind of aromatherapy kind of businesses. But I'm talking about smell as a way to convey information. So that a smell like roses will mean the stock market is booming. Or if you start smelling, I don't know, rotten eggs or something, you know that you should probably call your broker tomorrow. But we'll turn information into smell, and we will interact with data. Again, not just simply pleasing smells, but meaningful, information-bearing. We will turn the internet and our interaction with it into smell. Touch will be very important as well. Tactility, that could come in all kinds of ways. Maybe it's the movement of air through a space. Maybe it's devices that we'll wear on our bodies, but that pressure or some sort of haptic connection is not just simply something we'll feel on a video game console. It will be information as well. It'll be data to interact with. This is a data sculpture that I put together that's at the Lumos Gallery. Do you know the Lumos Gallery in the Short North? Stop by Lumos. It's a gallery for art and technology. But it's interesting. This is a data set that I was working with. It's interesting to watch people come up and want to touch it. I say, go ahead, by all means, touch it. Interact with data through touch, through haptics. In 1998, there were researchers at MIT at the Media Lab who created what they called the ambient room that did exactly what I'm just talking about right here, where a space was designed such that the GUI is not on the screen, it's sort of pushed out into the entire environment. So there was sound, there were smells, there were light patches, there were air currents, all these sorts of things moving through the space. And I think this is a really interesting representation for where our interface with the internet could go. And if we're going to intuit, if we're going to think about information across 6 dimensions, this, I think, is a really important way for how we're going to do it. The message I want to try to convey is not that the internet is this kind of competing intelligence that we have to fret about and worry about, and I'm going to lose my job over it, and it's going to take over, right, at the end of the day. But in fact, the message should be more, and this is the message from the Scottish elections, right, better together. And I think that has long been the story of our history, that we are better together with our tools, whether those be cave paintings or writing or any other sorts of aspects of culture, up to and including the internet. We are better together. I mentioned Watson once before. We all know what here's Watson. I should point out. This is what Watson is doing today. Watson is not answering trivia questions, but is now working with doctors. It's essentially an expert system in the medical field. It's a diagnostic tool that physicians are using today. Not taking over the job of physicians, physicians working with IBM Watson to make better diagnoses, to treat patients in a better fashion. And in fact, what some are suggesting is that the interactions that we're talking about here are between 2 brains, 2 intelligences. And we do this sort of thing all the time. I don't ride a horse, but people who ride horses will tell you those are 2 intelligences trying to work together. And they do it fairly well. They negotiate well together. And in essence, this is what we're going to be doing now with the intelligence that's represented by the internet. We will work together in the same way that horse and rider work together. I mentioned Watson before. We all know what, when Garry Kasparov lost to Deep Blue in 1997, people were saying, you know, like, the sky is falling, right? The computers are ready to take over because the greatest chess player ever has lost to a machine. Kasparov, in fact, took this moment and created a whole new movement called advanced chess. Does anybody play advanced chess? Know what this is? So this is teams of humans and computers competing against each other. And in fact, there was a tournament in 2005, not one of these that are represented up here, where a team of fairly average players with a kind of so-so software beat the grand champions and the best computers that were there. Better together. We will think better with our machines, and that's what's happening here in each one of these cases. Schooling, as I said at the beginning, is clearly going to be affected by this. And when I say interface, I don't mean just simply the interface, the physical interface between brain and internet, but interface in the way that we think about things like education, for instance, where this is going to be a thing in the past, right? This is cheating, right? He's Googling the answer, and this is wrong. We will get past the idea that this is what education is about, providing the answer. And in fact, this will be seen more and more as a sort of a common everyday occurrence. Of course, you're going to consult your device to be able to answer questions like that. There are better, more interesting questions, more important things that we could be doing than simply providing answers. That will be easy enough to do, I think. So when I talk about brain-internet interface, I'm talking about not just simply the physical interface, the way in which brain and internet will couple together and work together, but also this interface about what it means to think with tools. Right now, we don't really teach for that purpose. The idea is you can maybe have a calculator but nothing else, right? In fact, it used to be, like when I was in school, you can't use your calculator, right? That's cheating. We don't really have systems in place right now that teach people how to think with tools. That's where I think education is heading. That's where I think university education is heading. Ultimately, we will start to teach people how to think together with tools and to see tool and brain together as a very common, very typical way to engage in thinking. So I mean both physical interface and I mean this kind of cultural or educational interface as well. And designing that interface between our biological brain and our electronic brain will be the next great design challenge for the next 20 years. Who's with me? Thank you. Are you volunteering or is that a question?
It is a question.
Okay, okay.
First off, are you aware of the series Black Mirror by Charlie Brooker on Netflix? It seems right up your alley.
Okay, what's it called again?
Black Mirror.
Black Mirror. I will be aware of it now.
And the second thing is, do you know of any studies on recall, you know, where you're trying to remember something and rather than look at an IMDb, you actually are trying to do that, and if it's beneficial or not beneficial, or if it matters. And by the way, I did have to look up Charlie Brooker's name.
Of course, yes, and I'm going to do the same thing, right? I'm going to look it up as soon, you know, use. Yeah, there have been studies about this, yes. And is our recall being affected? Very, very likely, yes. And in particular, the sort of ready recall, the fact that I don't have to go to the library and look it up in an encyclopedia, for instance, that I can just simply speak into my device and be able to get those answers. So does that mean that recall gets affected? Absolutely, yes. The question is that a problem? That's the debate. Not, I mean, there's physiological evidence that that's happening. If you are someone like Nick Carr, this is clearly a problem. And it falls into the category of, we have always done things this way, and now we're doing things this other way. Therefore, this other way is wrong, bad, detrimental, means the end of human civilization as we know it, because it doesn't look like this. You can say that about, I think, a lot of things. Mike.
All I was going to say is, I've read a lot about it, and your brain definitely, the way habits form is different than the way other memories form. And so I agree with everything you're saying, but I think you still need some habit-forming aspects to education, in my opinion.
So the brain is not going to the human brain is not going to atrophy, and you weren't suggesting that.
No, I just
yes.
mean the way you get things. The reason we repeat things and practice
That's right.
things perfect is true. It's just the way our brain really works.
So and our brains will have to continue to work And Mike is not saying this, but I have had other people say, well, you know, if these machines are going to do all these kinds of cognitive tricks and engage in this kind of level of thinking, what's going to happen to our brains? And our brains are still going to have to be part of that partnership, right? It can't just simply sort of fall off. In fact, one of the best analogies I've seen is that electronic brain and biological brain are going to be like two hemispheres, kind of like what already exists in our head right now. Our brains are actually two hemispheres and really are two very different brains. Very, very different. But you need two together for them to function. It'll be the same with biological and electronic brains. They will each bring something to the table. They will each bring something to the table. And they will work together. There'll be a sort of a, I don't know, electronic corpus callosum or something like that that's going to connect the two together. One of the things that we have that machines don't have are bodies. Bodies, like physical bodies. And that actually proves to be really important in cognition. Artificial intelligence researchers are coming to understand that the fact that we have bodies is really important for cognition. So if I had like a baseball or something and I went like that to Norman, you'd catch it without any sort of difficulty at all. Robots can't do that. They haven't developed that capacity yet. They will eventually. The studies I'm seeing are suggesting, you know, past, you know, 2060 or something like that. We do these sorts of things all the time. Think about what a 2-year-old can do that robots still can't accomplish yet. So there are those that are suggesting we have bodies, and that's something that we would bring to this coupling, I suppose. Ethan, please.
Mentioning intuiting in 6 dimensions, I thought of an activity that's not, everyone doesn't do it now, but we do a lot of it, is flying a single-engine airplane. You've got X and Y and Z, you've got to plan for things in time, you're using your hearing, your balance and vestibular sense. You're using all these simultaneous dimensions to successfully pilot an airplane.
I've never done that before, so I'll take your word for it, but that's a great analogy, I think, for the sort of things we're talking about here. Michael, please.
So in Moore's law, the physical things are what limit our growth in computation power. What are the societal things that limit our learning ability and education in
That's a terrific question. So, in fact, we don't pay a lot of attention to limits. We sort of, again, we sort of assume that computing power and other sorts of things are limitless. There's some very interesting research that came out of the Goethe Institute in Germany that suggests that our brains are actually going to set the limit on the scope, the size of the internet, because we're approaching, and they've done the calculations. I'm not going to pretend to understand them. They've done the calculations to suggest that we're approaching this kind of asymptotic limit to what the brain can actually absorb of the information that's being created. And that might put an upper limit on the size, the scope, the scale of information, right? It's sort of similar to if you watch a chart of the Olympic champions in the 100 meters. If you start from the first Olympics in 1896 and look at it this way, it's been going like this. And it's not clear how much faster we can go outside of, I don't know, putting jets or other things on our bodies, but we're sort of approaching this sort of limit here. So there are those that suggest, yes, that our brains themselves are going to limit the growth of the internet in some fashion. Now, the flip side of that is that the internet could just simply grow and grow and grow and say, well, we're just going to leave you folks behind. And there are those who have thought through some interesting scenarios where our algorithms that are telling us, you know, here's the book you might want to buy next, or here's the Netflix you want to watch next, that in a sense they're going to develop what amounts to its own society. And the computers will be talking to each other over lines or over the internet, and we're going to have no idea what they're talking about. It'd be like watching someone in another language, saying, you know, what are they saying? What are they doing? And they're going to have, in a sense, their own kind of society, if we think that it will push on an intelligence that will push on beyond our brain's capacity, our brain's ability. Sam, you had your hand up as well?
Oh, yeah, I'll go with the original question. So a number of my friends have toddlers, and they are avoiding exposing them to tablets.
Right.
Small children in order to prevent whatever neurodevelopmental shifts are associated with exposure to computers.
Mm-hmm.
But as far as I can tell, there's no actual primary research that this is necessary or on what effect it would have compared to the other children who are presumably most going to be exposed.
What's the fear? Have they ever expressed that? What's the fear that they express?
The fear is that you get a mixture of things. Part of it's when they're teenagers, they won't pay attention to me, but I think that
You don't need an iPad for that to happen.
People are blaming the phones for that. I don't think they're. But then some of it is that they're going to not develop as much as it were real-world capacity. Their gross motor skills might be impaired. It's going to somehow turn them autistic, and they're not going to be able to pick up on other people's subtle social cues, or it runs the gambit.
That's right.
On sort of a lot of it's just sort of stereotypes about what people who use computers a lot are like, and they're afraid that if you give them a tablet, that's what they
Some of it is that, and some of it is also this, again, this is the way things have been done, and now we have this new sort of system that looks different from what we had before. I think that's where some of that comes in. I had an argument, a debate, with a parent once about this, who was a reader. And I said, what's the difference between your child with nose in a book versus their nose in a game or something like that? And game environments, of course, can be very, very complex. There's all sorts of interesting research about the kind of cognition that's happening as people are working with really sort of complex games. Because the argument I was having with this parent was about sociability. Join us here in the rest of the world. I said, you mean like when your nose is in a book? You're joining us here in the rest of the world? I think that there are clearly going to be changes. There are clear. I mean, there will clearly be changes. There will even be some problems, I think, that emerge from our dependence upon these tools. But again, the broader context I want to try to draw is there's nothing. Well, I won't say there's nothing new. That we've seen these sorts of things before, and I think we need to sort of step back and relax a bit and sort of say. We've wrestled with these sorts of issues before. This is not something new and problematic and full of all sorts of issues. Giorgio, do you have your hand up? I'm sorry, earlier? Or?
No, I'm
okay.
Very comfortable.
Oh, very good. Okay, good. Good. Hi.
I just had one comment to add.
Please.
To your collection of storing information in other senses.
Yes.
I forget which elite military op it was, but they taught their operatives their passwords by like touch memory, sort of like playing Guitar Hero, where there's no they didn't know which buttons they were pushing. It just kind of they memorized how it felt.
Yes.
So they couldn't give it up if they were being tortured. And I tried it out, and I used it to memorize my credit card number. So now, like I can think of it, but when I sit down on a computer to buy something online, I just go.
Yeah, I'm that way now with phone numbers, for instance, in my phone. I know I have muscle memory of what to hit, but if you told me if you asked me what the phone number was, I'd really have to sort of think about it, right? That sort of muscle memory. So, like in Minority Report, right, where Tom Cruise is sort of moving information around, or that Elk and Elk commercial where the guy with the weird hair is moving things around like that. I think that that's also going to be a reality as well, that we'll sort of move information that will be sort of virtually in a space like this, and that we'll interact with it in that fashion with better hair. Yes?
Something I realized that when I was a kid and phones were still connected to a wire, I remember I had like 20 numbers in my head. If I had to call friends, stuff like that, home, I could do it no problem. Now I have like maybe 3 or 5 that I actually can do without having to look it up.
Yeah.
But now I have like 200. If I have to call the dentist that I only talk to, I don't have to go to a phone book, look at pick up, or find a business card, whatever. It's just like, oh.
In the long history of information and the long history of humans' sort of interface with information, in a sense, you could boil it down to a sentence, which is offloading parts of our memory onto external devices. That's in part what Socrates was worried about, that we'd be offloading so much memory that our brains would be sort of emptied out. And in essence, I think that's what the long history of brain and culture has been all about. And I think it'll be true with the internet, too. So what does that free up our brains to do then? This is the argument that was made, and I think is still made in some degree with calculators in the math classroom. So 30 years ago, when small, 35 years ago now, I guess it was, when small, easily available pocket calculators are made available, you had people saying, well, why do I have to memorize times tables, right? I can just simply punch those in. And then you had others on the other side saying, no, children have to know their times tables because they have to know their times tables. But then the flip argument to that was, well, instead of teaching their times tables, we could then have them do higher order math, higher order sort of thinking, these sorts of things. There's a terrific scene in Star Trek: The Next Generation. I'm going to burnish my geek credentials here a bit. And it was in one of the early seasons, so this is a number of years ago. And it had nothing to do with the story. It was just one of these sort of throwaway things to sort of say, look at how the future is different from the present. But it's a father, it's a kid trailing after the father, and the kid is probably no more than 9 or 10. And the father says, "Get back in there and do your calculus homework, young man," to a 10-year-old. And the idea was, we're way past, shapes and fractions and those sorts of things. Kids as young as 9 and 10 are already working on advanced calculus and these sorts of things. And I think the same sort of debates we're having about calculators, that's in essence the conversation we're having about the brain and the internet today, right? Should it have a role in our classrooms, especially if students are going to cheat and simply find answers that should be embossed in their brains? Though I think you're going to find other pedagogues that are saying, what is it that we really want our brains to be used for, I think.
My son just turned 24, and when he was going through high school, the calculator was required from that class. Whereas
Right.
when I was going through, it was like, no, you can't have it.
That's right. Yeah, that's a real change. And the kind of calculators, of course, are very different. It's not just simply simple functions now. It's graphing calculators and these sorts of things. As it should be. We should be teaching kids how to use calculators to calculate. We should be teaching them how to use the internet to engage in cognition. That should be part of education. That will be part of education. I'm convinced of this.
But I've been teaching engineers for 30 years, just about. And the way in which we teach the fundamentals, whether it's dynamics, thermodynamics, fluid mechanics, is changing dramatically. I'm not saying that every professor thinks that way, but what you just said, that the tools are an extension of the brain, is something that is matter of course today in the way we assign work to students and the way we teach them. If I think about the way I learned the same subjects 35 years ago, it was not. I mean, we did it the hard way because that was the only way there was. So I think that in some the more technological disciplines, let me say, tools as an extension of your brain has been a progressive thing that is just happening. It's natural. So no objections on my part.
You're right.
You said, okay. And so in this audience, I think it's pretty obvious. But I think that to those who are outside the technology, it can look more scary. I think that's what the message is, right?
Yes.
People worry about it.
Yes, it looks unnatural. There's something unseemly about it, right?
It's like the great debate about printing versus cursive writing.
Yes.
They don't teach cursive writing
Anymore.
in school anymore.
Yeah.
But all these, I had a discussion with some of my friends. They all have these mother's books where they wrote beautiful things in writing, and their children may not be able to read it. So they're
Certainly can't write it.
Right. And a lot of people are teaching their children how to write cursive, even though it's not required in school.
Something that's come out just recently is Google's show your phone at the language, and it translates in real time on your phone. And when I was a kid, we had Berlitz records and audio tapes and recitation. And something I've wanted for 25 years is a little ROM socket. Oh, I want to learn Chinese. Dunk, done.
That's right. Or I don't even have to learn Chinese. We're not there yet, obviously, but someday I could just simply speak into a device like this, and out will come Mandarin or wait a minute, Turkish, or we're not quite there yet, but we're getting there. We're getting to that stage where I won't have to learn another language. Yes. So Vince is standing up, so I assume that means I'm getting the hook here. So thank you. Thank you very much.